My hands would not stop shaking the moment he walked into the hall. Not Drethahal. Everyone expected me to tremble at the sight of Commander Drethahal of the Vexury hegemony. And yes, he was terrifying in all the obvious ways. 7 feet of black chitinous plating, mandibles that could crack ship hull, eyes like wet stones set deep in a skull designed by evolution for one single purpose, which was killing things larger than himself. He had burned colony worlds. He had ended bloodlines. His name was spoken in whispers across 9 star systems, and tomorrow he might become my husband. But my hands were steady when Drethal entered the mirror gallery of my father's palace. I had grown up surrounded by warlords. I understood their kind the way a river understands rocks. They were hard and heavy and dangerous, but they were also predictable. You could map the trajectory of their violence. You could see it building in their posture, taste it in their pheromones, read it in the microflare of their cranial ridges. Drethal was a predator, but he was a predator I had been trained to manage since birth. No, my hands started shaking because of the human. My name is Vayetha, 3rd princess of the Kelari Dominion, and in one day, I would stand at the altar of accord and speak the name of my bonded mate. This was not a romance. This was a transaction older than our empire, a ritual that had kept the Dominion stable for 11 generations. The princess chooses, the alliance forms. The borders hold. My grandmother chose a Telleri fleet commander and secured the northern passage for 80 years. My aunt chose a Nirathi trade prince and opened the mineral corridor that funded our expansion into the Vale Nebula. Now it was my turn. 23 years old by galactic standard count, the youngest princess ever selected for the Accord, and I was supposed to smile and speak a name and hand my life to a stranger for the good of the Dominion. The suitors had been arriving for 3 days. Each one presented himself in the mirror gallery, a vast circular chamber where holographic projections displayed their territories, their fleets, their lineage records. Commander Drethal had projected his conquest map, and the red zones of subjugated worlds had covered half the ceiling. Lord Paxan of the Ritheri Conclave had displayed his trade networks, glittering lines of commerce stretching across 2 galactic arms. High Emissary Nulthek of the Sorvani Union had presented his diplomatic record, 47 treaties brokered without a single breach. All of them were powerful. All of them wanted the Dominion at their side. All of them looked at me and saw a throne, a border, a strategic advantage wrapped in ceremonial robes. And then the human arrived. He was a late addition. Earth's Galactic Liaison Office had sent a cultural observer to the Accord as part of their provisional membership agreement. It was standard protocol for emerging species. They were allowed to watch, to learn, to take notes. They were not suitors. They had no standing, no territory worth mentioning, no fleet that registered on any serious strategic assessment. Humans had been part of the galactic community for less than 30 years. They were a curiosity, nothing more. His name was Ben Harlow. Sergeant Ben Harlow, according to the diplomatic brief my attendant handed me. 31 years old. Born on a continent called North America, in a region called Montana. Military service record with some kind of ground forces division. No notable campaigns. No conquered worlds. No political connections. He entered the mirror gallery alone. No entourage, no projection display. He wore a simple gray uniform with a small flag on the shoulder, blue and red and white, the kind of modest emblem that a child might draw. He was shorter than every other delegate in the room. He had no claws, no armored skin, no cranial ridges, no venom glands, no bioluminescent threat display. His skin was soft and pale brown. His teeth, when he offered a polite smile to the doorkeeper, were blunt and small. He should have been invisible. In a room full of conquerors and kings, he should have been background noise. But I could not stop watching him. He stood near the eastern wall, arms crossed, weight balanced on both feet. He did not posture. He did not puff himself up, or emit dominance pheromones or angle his body to claim space. He just stood there and watched the room, and his eyes moved the way I had only ever seen targeting systems move, smooth and constant and unhurried, cataloging every face, every exit, every weapon in the hall. I have been around dangerous creatures my entire life. I know what a threat looks like when it is trying to be seen, and I know what a threat looks like when it is not trying at all. Ben Harlow was not trying at all. A Retheri attendant bumped into him while carrying a tray of ceremonial drinks. Harlow caught the tray before it fell, steadied the attendant's arm, smiled, said something quiet that made the Retheri laugh, and then returned to his position against the wall. The whole interaction took 4 seconds. His hand had moved faster than the tray fell. His grip on the attendant's arm was precise enough to stabilize without bruising, and the moment the social interaction ended, his eyes went right back to scanning the room. That was when my hands started shaking. I left the gallery before the final presentations. My attendants assumed I was overwhelmed by the occasion. They brought me warm broth and a compression blanket, and spoke soft reassurances about the honor of the accord. I did not drink the broth. I stood on the balcony of my quarters and stared at the darkening sky, and tried to understand why a creature with no claws, and no armor, and blunt little teeth had made my stomach feel like it was filled with cold water. My father found me there an hour later. Emperor Korvan was a large man by Kelari standards, broad through the shoulders, with deep green skin and the gold-flecked eyes that marked our royal bloodline. He had been a warrior once, before the crown settled on his brow, and he still carried himself like someone who remembered what it felt like to hold a blade. He stood beside me on the balcony and said nothing for a while. That was his way. He waited until the silence became a question. "I know you are afraid," he said finally. I nodded. "Drethal is formidable," he continued. "I will not pretend otherwise. His reputation is earned, but the Vexuri are bound by their own codes of honor, and a bonded mate holds protected status under their law. He would not harm you, Vietha. The alliance would be too valuable to risk." I almost laughed. My father, the Emperor, the most perceptive political mind in the Dominion, had looked at my shaking hands and drawn exactly the wrong conclusion. "It is not Drethal," I said quietly. He frowned. "Paxson, the Retheri are traitors, not fighters. Surely he does not frighten you." "No." "Then who?" I opened my mouth to answer and stopped. How could I explain it? How could I tell my father, a man who had faced down armadas and negotiated with species that ate their enemies, that the thing keeping me awake was a soft-skinned sergeant from a provisional species who had caught a falling tray and smiled at a servant? It sounded absurd. It was absurd, and yet my hands were still shaking. "It does not matter," I said. "I will be ready for the ceremony." My father studied me for a long moment, the way he studied intelligence reports, looking for the detail that did not fit. Then he kissed the top of my head, told me to rest, and left. I did not rest. Instead, I went to my personal console and accessed the Dominion's intelligence archive. I searched for humans. The file was disturbingly thin. Most emerging species had thousands of pages of cultural analysis, military assessments, psychological profiles. Humans had 47 pages, and over half were redacted under a classification level I had never seen before. Level Omega. That designation was reserved for existential threats. I read what was available. Humans were a Class 12 Death World species, which meant their home planet was actively hostile to life. High gravity, volatile weather, predators in every biome, toxic flora, seismic instability. They had evolved not through specialization, but through a stubborn, terrifying refusal to die. They could survive temperature ranges that would kill most galactic species. They healed from wounds that should have been fatal. They could function without sleep for days, operate under pain that would shut down a Vexuri nervous system, and they had a chemical response to danger that did not trigger retreat. When most species encountered a lethal threat, their biology screamed at them to run. When humans encountered a lethal threat, their biology flooded their muscles with stimulants, and their brain with focus chemicals, and their entire body said fight. But that was not the part that made my blood go cold. The last unredacted section of the file was a single analyst note, flagged with 3 urgency markers. It read simply, "Do not threaten what they have claimed. There is no known de-escalation protocol." Once a human has identified a person, a group, or a cause as theirs, the cost of removing that bond exceeds any known military threshold. They will not stop. They do not stop. The concept of acceptable losses does not exist in their threat response framework. Beneath that, someone had added a handwritten annotation in old Kalori script, the kind used for warnings on tomb doors. They are not the most dangerous species because of what they can do. They are the most dangerous species because of what they are willing to do for others. I closed the file and sat in darkness for a long time. Tomorrow, I would walk into the Accord Hall and choose a mate from a curated selection of the galaxy's most powerful beings. And somewhere in that hall, standing against a wall with his arms crossed and his blunt teeth hidden behind a polite smile, would be a man who was not even a candidate, who had no fleet and no claws and no kingdom, and who frightened me more than all the warlords in the Dominion combined. I did not sleep that night. The welcome feast began at sunrise. The great dining hall of my father's palace had been dressed in traditional Accord colors, deep violet and gold, with bioluminescent arrangements climbing the columns and casting slow-moving patterns of light across the vaulted ceiling. 300 delegates filled the tiered seating, a cross-section of the galaxy's most powerful factions, all pretending to enjoy each other's company while their intelligence operatives mapped the room. I was seated at the high table between my father and his chief advisor, Counselor Tethanon. Drethahal sat 4 chairs down, his massive frame barely contained by the reinforced seating, and the slow pulse of his dominance pheromones made the air around him thick and bitter. Lord Paxson was across the table, making quiet conversation with a Narathi ambassador. High Emissary Nulthek was studying a data tablet half concealed beneath his napkin, probably running trade projections during the appetizer course. And Ben Harlow was at a low table near the servants' entrance, eating calmly, talking to a Kalari kitchen attendant like they were old friends. I watched him between bites of my own meal, which I was not really eating. He used utensils he had clearly never seen before, with the careful adaptability of someone who paid attention. He asked the attendant questions. He listened. At one point, the attendant said something, and Harlow laughed. A real laugh, not the controlled diplomatic chuckle I had heard from every other delegate this week, but a genuine, unguarded burst of warmth. The sound carried. Several delegates glanced toward the low tables with mild confusion. Laughter at a political feast was not unusual, but that kind of laughter, the kind that came from actual enjoyment of another person's company, was rare enough to draw attention. I noticed something else. Between the conversation and the laughter, and the careful handling of unfamiliar utensils, Harlow's eyes never stopped moving. He tracked the serving staff's routes. He noted which doors opened and which stayed sealed. He clocked the positions of the palace guards and the gaps between their patrol rotations. He was doing it automatically, the way I breathed automatically. Awareness was not a skill he practiced, it was a condition he lived in. After the feast, I had 2 hours before the afternoon exhibition. I used them to do something I had never done before in my life, which was to seek out conversations with delegations I had no strategic interest in. I started with the Tellerai ambassador, a tall, thin-limbed creature with silver skin and wide, expressive eyes. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, what his people knew about humans. He set down his glass and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. It was somewhere between pity and caution. "Why do you ask, Princess?" "Curiosity." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you heard of Orvan Station?" I had not. He told me. Orvan Station was a mining outpost on the edge of Tellerai space. Small, remote. 93 workers, mostly Tellerai, some Narathi, a handful of species from the outer colonies, and 41 children living in the residential module while their parents worked the extraction rigs. 3 years ago, a Kreth raiding fleet had descended on the station. 2,000 Kreth warriors against a civilian outpost with no military garrison. The Kreth wanted the mineral reserves. The workers were disposable. The children were irrelevant. But there were humans on that station, 40 of them. Engineers and technicians on a joint species infrastructure contract. They were not soldiers. They had no combat training beyond basic safety certification. They had sidearms and welding tools and emergency fire axes. When the Kreth hit the station, every strategic calculation said the same thing. Surrender. Hand over the minerals. Evacuate if possible. No 93-person mining crew could hold against 2,000 raiders. The humans did not surrender. They barricaded the residential module where the children were. They welded doors shut, rigged power conduits as improvised traps, turned mining equipment into weapons, and they held. For 19 days. 2,000 Kreth warriors against 40 human engineers, and for 19 days, the residential module did not fall. Not because the humans were stronger, or better armed, or tactically superior, but because every time the Kreth breached a section, the humans counterattacked with a ferocity that the Kreth had never encountered before. They fought in shifts, they slept in 2-hour rotations, they ate emergency rations standing up and went back to the barricades before the wrappers hit the floor. When the Tellerai relief fleet finally arrived on day 20, the Kreth had lost 400 warriors. The humans had lost 12. The remaining 28 were still standing at the barricades, bleeding, exhausted, half-starved, and absolutely refusing to move. The children were not human, the ambassador said. Not a single one. Tellerai, Nerathi, outer colony species the humans had never met before arriving at that station. They held the line for 19 days for children that were not their own. I felt the cold water sensation in my stomach again. Why? I asked. The ambassador looked at me for a long time. I asked the same question to one of the human survivors. She was a structural engineer. She had a piece of rebar through her shoulder, and she was still conscious. I asked her why they fought. She said, and I will never forget this, she said the children were scared. That was her entire explanation. The children were scared. I thanked the ambassador and moved on. I found a Nerathi trader in the observatory lounge and asked the same question. What did he know about humans? He told me about a human cargo captain named Ellie Marsh, who had worked the Nerathi shipping lanes for 6 years. She had a mixed species crew of 11, and her first mate was a young Nerathi male named Solvan. When slavers took Solvan during a port raid, Ellie Marsh did not file a report. She did not contact authorities. She did not petition the Galactic Assembly for intervention. She tracked the slaver fleet alone for 11 months, across 3 sectors. She sold her cargo. She sold her backup cargo. She sold her personal belongings. She modified her ship's engines beyond safety limits. She followed that fleet through regions of space that appeared on no official charts, through pirate corridors and dead zones and radiation fields that would have killed most species within hours. She found Solvan in a labor camp on an unregistered moon. She landed her ship on the camp's power generator, destroying it and killing the lights. Then she walked into the camp with 2 pistols and a cutting torch, and she brought her first mate out. The Nerathi trader shook his head slowly as he finished the story. 11 months, he said. She nearly died 9 times. Her ship was held together with patch tape and hope. And when I asked her why she did it, she looked at me like I had asked the most stupid question in the universe. She said he was her crew. That evening, the exhibition began. Each suitor was invited to present a demonstration of their culture's martial tradition. It was ceremonial, a chance to display strength and discipline for the court. The Rytheri performed a synchronized formation drill. The Sorvani displayed a holographic recreation of their greatest diplomatic triumph. The minor delegates offered poetry and song. Then Drethahal took the floor. The Vexuri combat tradition was not subtle. A caged beast was brought into the exhibition ring, a horned creature from the Vexuri homeworld, with thick muscle and sharp tusks. Drethal entered the ring unarmed. The cage opened. He killed it in 4 strikes. Each blow was precise, targeted, devastatingly efficient. The beast lunged, and Drethal sidestepped, crushed its forward knee joint, broke its spine at 2 points, and ended it with a single downward strike to the skull. The court applauded. My father nodded with the measured approval of a man who understood violence as a tool. I was not watching Drethal. I was watching Ben Harlow. He stood against the far wall, arms crossed, a glass of something amber in one hand. He watched the combat demonstration the way I imagined an engineer might watch a machine being tested. There was no excitement in his expression, no fear, no admiration. He was reading Drethal. I could see it happening in real time. His eyes tracked the Vexuri commander's footwork, noted the weight distribution, measured the rotation of the hips on each strike, cataloged the recovery time between movements. When the demonstration ended and the applause filled the hall, Harlow took a sip of his drink, set it down on a passing attendant's tray, and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was bored. No, that was not right. He was not bored. He was finished. He had seen everything he needed to see. In the time it took Drethahal to kill a caged animal, Ben Harlow had mapped every weakness in the commander's fighting style, filed it away, and moved on. I went back to my quarters that night and sat at my personal console, but I did not open any files. I opened my private journal, the encrypted one, that not even my father's intelligence staff could access, and I wrote the truth that I could not say to anyone. I have met predators before. Drethal is a predator. He kills because his biology built him for it, and his culture rewards him for it. He is dangerous, the way a storm is dangerous. Powerful and indiscriminate, and ultimately mechanical. The human is something else entirely. Ben Harlow could kill. I have no doubt of this. I watched him catch a falling tray faster than gravity could claim it, and stabilize a startled attendant without leaving a bruise, and those same hands could just as easily break a throat or disarm a soldier. But he chooses not to. And that choice is what makes him more dangerous than anything in this palace. Because it means that when he does choose violence, it will not be instinct. It will not be reflex. It will be a decision. And I am learning, through every story I collect and every quiet observation I make, that humans do not make decisions halfway. They decide, and then they do not stop. I set down my writing tool and stared at the wall and tried to imagine what it must be like to live inside a mind like that. A mind that could laugh with a kitchen servant and map a kill trajectory in the same heartbeat. A mind that could cross 3 sectors of hostile space for a single crewmate, or hold a barricade for 19 days for children it had never met. I could not imagine it. My entire species, my entire civilization, operated on calculations, cost and benefit, risk and reward. Every alliance, every marriage, every war was a math problem, and we solved it with precision and detachment. Humans did not calculate. They decided something mattered, and then they burned everything in their path until that thing was safe. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever encountered, not because of what it could do to me, but because some part of me, a small and frightened part that I did not want to acknowledge, wondered what it would feel like to matter that much to someone. I closed my journal. I turned off the lights. I did not sleep. The alarms began at 3 hours past midnight, not the soft chime of a schedule reminder or the double tone of a weather alert. This was the deep, bone-shaking pulse that vibrated through the walls and floor and ceiling, the sound that meant the palace perimeter had been breached. I had heard it once before, during a drill when I was 9 years old, and my mother had gathered me into her arms and carried me to the secure chamber beneath the throne room. My mother was dead now. There was no one to carry me. I was out of bed and into the corridor before the second pulse finished. My personal guard, 2 Quillari soldiers in full ceremonial armor, flanked me instantly. We moved fast, bare feet on cold stone, toward the secure wing on the palace's western side. The third pulse came with something new, an explosion, deep and muffled, somewhere below us, in the foundations. The floor lurched. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine streams. "What is happening?" I demanded. My guard did not answer immediately. He was listening to his communicator, his expression tightening with each transmission. Then he said, "Keth Varosi, cloaked assault teams. They breached through the drainage network beneath the eastern gardens." The Keth Varosi. I knew the name, a rogue faction opposed to the Dominion's expansion into shared space. They had conducted raids on border stations and supply convoys, small-scale harassment that our military had dismissed as manageable. But this was not a border station. This was the Imperial Palace on the eve of the Accord. "How many?" I asked. "Reports are still coming in, at least 60. They are using electromagnetic disruptors. The palace shield grid is down. Ground-level defense systems are offline. 60 Keth Varosi assault troops inside the palace, with the defense grid disabled. 300 delegates from a dozen species, most of them civilian diplomats and trade officials. My father, the Emperor, somewhere in the building with his personal guard, probably already moving toward the secure chamber. We ran. The palace corridors, which I had walked 1,000 times in calm daylight, felt like a different building in the dark. Emergency lighting cast everything in dim red. The bioluminescent arrangements that had been so beautiful at the feast hung dead and dark from the columns, their power cells drained by the electromagnetic disruption. We turned a corner into the northern gallery, and my guard stopped so suddenly that I crashed into his back. Commander Drethal was in the gallery. He was fully armored, his Vexuri warplate sealed and humming with residual power. His personal escort, 6 Vexuri soldiers in matching armor, formed a tight wedge around him. They were moving toward the shuttle bay, not the secure chamber. "Commander," my guard said, "the secure wing is this way. We should consolidate." Drethal looked at us. His mandibles clicked once, a gesture I had learned to read as dismissal. "This is not my war," he said. "The accord has been compromised. I will return to my ship and contact the hegemony. The princess requires escort," my guard pressed. "The princess has her own guard." I stared at him. This was the suitor my father favored, the alliance that would secure our spinward border. The fearsome Commander Drethal, destroyer of colonies, killer of beasts, the most physically imposing being in the Accord delegation. He was leaving. He looked at me, and I saw the calculation behind his stone eyes. Cost and benefit, risk and reward. Protecting me carried risk. Retreating to his ship carried none. The hegemony would negotiate my release if it came to that. I was a variable in his equation, not a person. "If the situation stabilizes," he said, "the hegemony remains open to negotiation." Then he turned and walked away. 6 armored soldiers followed him toward the shuttle bay, their heavy footsteps fading into the red-lit darkness. My guard swore under his breath, which was something I had never heard a palace guard do. We kept moving. We made it another 3 corridors before everything went wrong. The Keth Varosi had been smarter than our intelligence suggested. They had not just breached the perimeter, they had mapped the internal layout. They knew where the secure wing was, and they had placed teams along every primary route. We came around a corner and met 6 of them. They were smaller than I expected. The Keth Varosi were a subset of the Kethrani species, compact and quick, with mottled gray skin and 4 arms that each held a weapon. They wore light tactical gear designed for speed. They were not here to hold territory. They were here to take prisoners. My guard reacted instantly. He shoved me backward and engaged the nearest 2, but his weapon fired once and then died, the electromagnetic disruption finally reaching the last of the palace's internal systems. He drew his blade and fought, and for 3 seconds I thought he would hold them. He did not hold them. A pulse round took him in the chest. His armor absorbed most of it, but the impact drove him into the wall, and before he could recover, 2 more rounds found the gaps between his plates. He went down. My second guard stepped over his body and put herself between me and the Keth Varosi. She had her blade out, and her stance was perfect, exactly as the combat instructors taught. Weight low, blade angled, eyes forward. She lasted 7 seconds. She wounded one of them, a deep cut across the forward left arm, before they overwhelmed her. 4 armed opponents in close quarters, fighting 2 at once. She never had a chance. She fell, and I was alone. I backed into the corridor wall. The 6 Keth Varosi looked at me, and I saw the moment they recognized my ceremonial sleep garments, the gold threading that marked royal blood. One of them spoke into a communicator. I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone. They had found what they came for. The leader stepped forward. His weapon was not raised. He did not need it to be. I was unarmed, unarmored, barefoot on cold stone, and there was nowhere to run. I heard footsteps. One set. Coming from the corridor behind the Keth Varosi. Not running, walking. Measured, even strides. The kind of pace that covered ground without wasting energy. The kind of pace that said the person walking was not hurrying, because hurrying would not change what was about to happen. The Keth Varosi heard it too. The rear pair turned. Ben Harlow came around the corner. He was not wearing armor. He was in the same gray uniform he had worn at the feast, now torn at one shoulder and streaked with something dark. He had a sidearm in his right hand, taken from a fallen guard somewhere in the palace, and a heavy cylindrical object in his left hand that took me a moment to identify as a fire suppression canister. He stopped walking. He looked at the 6 Kethvarosi. He looked past them at me. Something changed in his face. It was not anger exactly. It was not rage. It was something quieter and worse. It was the look of a man making a decision. "Get behind me," he said to me. His voice was calm, conversational, the same tone he had used when talking to the kitchen attendant about whatever had made them both laugh. I could not move. I was frozen against the wall. Harlow looked at the Kethvarosi again and said something else, something I did not catch, and then he moved. He threw the fire suppression canister at the rear pair. It struck the wall beside them and erupted in a blast of white chemical foam that blinded them instantly. In the same motion, before the canister finished bouncing, he closed the distance to the nearest Kethvarosi and took his weapon. Not with a technique, not with a trained maneuver. He grabbed the weapon arm, twisted it at a joint that the Kethvarosi's anatomy should not have allowed to bend that way, and pulled the weapon free as the soldier screamed. The leader fired at him. The pulse round caught Harlow in the left shoulder and spun him sideways. I saw the impact, saw the way his body absorbed it like a tree absorbing wind, bending but not breaking. He kept moving. The momentum of the spin became a pivot, and he came out of it, facing the leader with the stolen weapon already aimed. He fired twice. The leader dropped. The remaining 4 converged on him, and for the next 10 seconds, I watched something I had no framework to understand. Harlow did not fight the way Drethal fought. There was no exhibition, no display, no demonstration of martial tradition. He fought the way water finds the lowest point, flowing around resistance, exploiting every gap, every half-second of hesitation, every moment when an opponent's weight was on the wrong foot. He used the corridor walls. He used the fallen bodies. He used the blinding foam still hanging in the air. He took hits, a gash across his forearm, a glancing blow to his ribs, and he did not slow down. His body registered pain and overruled it in the same instant. 12 seconds after he rounded that corner, 6 Kethvarosi were on the ground, and Ben Harlow was standing in the middle of them, breathing hard, bleeding from 3 wounds he did not seem to notice. He looked at me. "You okay?" I could not speak. My mouth opened and nothing came out. I nodded. He checked the corridor in both directions, the same automatic scanning I had watched him do at the feast, but faster now, sharper, every sense dialed to maximum. Then he looked at me, and his voice softened, just slightly, just enough that I could hear the human underneath the soldier. "We need to move. Stay behind me. Step where I step. If something happens to me, go left. There is a service elevator 30 meters back the way I came. It goes to the basement level. There is a water maintenance tunnel that exits beyond the garden wall. Can you remember that?" He had been in this palace for 3 days. He already knew the layout of the service tunnels. He had already mapped escape routes, and he was telling them to me, in case he died, because he had already accepted that as a possible outcome, and his only concern in that scenario was making sure I survived. I nodded again. We moved. The palace was burning. Not everywhere, but in patches where the Kethvarosi had used incendiary devices to create confusion and block movement. Smoke filled the upper corridors. Emergency ventilation was down. Harlow moved through it with a cloth over his nose and mouth, one hand on his stolen weapon, one hand occasionally reaching back to touch my arm. A gentle pressure that said, "Still here, still with you, keep going." We encountered 2 more groups. The first was a pair of Kethvarosi scouts moving through a side corridor. Harlow saw them before they saw us. He pressed me into an alcove, put his finger to his lips, and waited until they passed. No violence, no confrontation, just patience and awareness, and the understanding that fighting was a tool, not a compulsion. The second group was larger, 5 Kethvarosi, holding a junction that we needed to pass through. Harlow studied them for 30 seconds from behind a support column. Then he pulled a broken light fixture from the wall, threw it down a parallel corridor to draw 2 of them away, and engaged the remaining 3 before they could regroup. This time it was faster. He knew their patterns now. He had fought enough of them to understand their timing, their reach, the way their 4 arms coordinated. He took the first one down with the sidearm, the second with a strike to a nerve cluster I did not know the Kethrani had, and the third with a restraint hold that immobilized all 4 arms simultaneously. He did not kill the third one. He restrained him, checked that the restraint would hold, and moved on. "Why did you not finish him?" I whispered as we ran. "He was down," Harlow said, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did, because I realized in that moment that Ben Harlow did not enjoy violence. He was breathtakingly effective at it, but there was no pleasure in his execution, no satisfaction in the dropping of an enemy. He used exactly as much force as the situation required, and not a single fraction more. We reached the corridor outside the secure chamber. The palace guard was there, 6 soldiers in full armor, holding the entrance. My father was inside. Harlow walked me to the guard line. He checked my injuries, which were non-existent, because he had not allowed me to be touched. He looked at the guard captain and said, "She is unharmed. 2 of her personal guard are down in Corridor 7, Northern Gallery level. They need medical extraction." He remembered. In the middle of running through a burning palace with enemy soldiers around every corner, he remembered where my fallen guards were, and made sure someone would go back for them. My father emerged from the secure chamber, Emperor Korvan, in full regalia, his ceremonial blade drawn, his face tight with a mixture of rage and relief. He saw me, and his expression cracked open for 1 second of pure parental terror, before he sealed it again. "Vayetha," he said. "I am unharmed," I told him. "Because of him." I pointed at Harlow. My father looked at the human, took in the torn uniform, the blood, the stolen weapon, the impossible fact that this small, soft-skinned creature had walked his daughter through a war zone without a scratch. "The palace thanks you," my father began, in his formal voice. "There are staff in the East Wing," Harlow said, interrupting an emperor, which no one in the history of the Dominion had ever done and survived. "Kitchen workers, groundskeepers, maintenance crews. They are not military, and they do not have weapons. The Keth Varosi are concentrating forces in the central atrium, which means the East Wing is going to be cut off within the next 10 minutes. My father stared at him. "The palace guard will conduct a sweep once the perimeter is re-established. In 10 minutes, those people will be hostages or dead. I am going now." He said it simply, without defiance, without heroic posturing. He said it the way someone might say they were going to check the mail, and then he turned and walked back into the smoke-filled corridor. My father reached for him. "Sergeant, the palace is not yet secure. I cannot guarantee your safety." Harlow looked back over his shoulder. "I know," he said, and kept walking. He was going back, into the fire, into the enemy-held sections of a palace he had no obligation to defend, for people he had never met. Kitchen workers who served food, groundskeepers who trimmed hedges, people whose names he did not know, and whose species he could barely identify. He was going back because they were there, and he was here, and he could help. And for Ben Harlow, that calculation was the simplest one in the universe. I grabbed my father's arm. The words came out of me raw and shaking, and completely beyond my control. "Not him, Dad. I am terrified of that human warrior." My father looked at me, confusion first, then something slower, deeper, a dawning understanding that he was not yet ready to complete. "He is saving lives, Vayetha," he said carefully. "Why does that frighten you?" I could not answer him. Not yet. Because the terror had changed shape again. It was not the fear of a predator anymore. It was not the fear of violence or destruction, or any of the things I had been trained to recognize and manage. It was the fear of discovering that everything I had been taught about how the galaxy worked was wrong. The galaxy ran on calculation, cost and benefit, risk and reward. Every species I had ever encountered, including my own, made decisions based on what they would gain and what they would lose. It was rational. It was sensible. It was the architecture of civilization itself. Ben Harlow did not calculate. He decided that people mattered, and then he moved toward the fire. I stood in that corridor and listened to his footsteps fade, and I was terrified because I understood, finally, what it meant. It meant that somewhere in this enormous, cold, transactional galaxy, there existed a species that fought and bled and died, not for territory, or resources, or strategic advantage, but because someone, somewhere, was afraid and alone, and they could not bear to let that stand. I listened until I could not hear his footsteps anymore. Then I turned to my father and said, "We need to send guards with him." My father hesitated for 1 second. Then he nodded. "Go," he told the guard captain. "All available units, East Wing, follow the human." The guards went. I stood in the doorway of the secure chamber and waited. I do not know how long. It felt like hours. It might have been 40 minutes. When the all-clear finally sounded, the reports came in waves. The Keth Varosi had been routed. 38 captured. The rest had fled through the drainage tunnels. The palace was damaged but standing. And 18 staff members in the East Wing were alive because a human sergeant with 3 bleeding wounds and a stolen sidearm had walked into a burning building for people whose names he did not know. The morning after the attack, the palace smelled like smoke and disinfectant. Repair crews were already working on the damaged sections, replacing shattered columns and resealing breached walls. Delegations were filing formal protests and security assessments. The Vexuri shuttle had departed during the night, Drethal having apparently decided that his cost-benefit analysis required distance. 3 minor delegations had also withdrawn. The Accord was in turmoil. My father was in meetings that had started before dawn and showed no signs of ending. Councillor Tethafon was managing diplomatic fallout with the frantic efficiency of someone trying to catch water in their hands. And Ben Harlow was in the medical bay, arguing with a Kilari medic about wound sealant. I went to see him. My attendants objected. Protocol demanded that I remain in the secure wing until the full security sweep was completed. I told my attendants that Protocol had also demanded that Commander Drethal defend his intended bondmate, and we had all seen how that went. They stopped objecting. The medical bay was on the palace's lower level, a long white room with soft lighting and the gentle hum of diagnostic equipment. Harlow was sitting on an examination platform, shirtless, while a Kilari medic applied biosealant to the gash on his forearm. He had 7 wounds in total, 3 from the fight in the corridor, 2 more from the East Wing operation, and 2 others he had apparently failed to mention until someone noticed the blood. He was arguing with the medic, but gently. "It itches," he said. "The sealant is bonding with your tissue matrix. Some discomfort is expected." "I know it is expected. I am telling you it itches." "Please remain still, Sergeant." "I am still. I am just also itchy." The medic made a sound that I recognized as Kolari exasperation, a clicking of the secondary palate that roughly translated to, "I do not have time for this." Harlow caught the sound and grinned, and even from across the room I could see that the grin was real. He was genuinely amused. He was sitting in a foreign medical facility with 7 holes in his body, on a planet that was not his, surrounded by species he had met for the first time a week ago, and he was smiling because the wound sealant itched. He saw me. The grin faded. Not into hostility or discomfort, but into something quieter. He sat up straighter, and his hands moved to his lap, a gesture that I recognized was probably a cultural reflex of his species. Politeness in the presence of someone he considered important. The medic stepped back. I walked forward. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I realized that this was the first time I had been in his presence without a crowd around us, without the noise of a feast or the smoke of a burning building between us. Just him, and me, and the hum of medical equipment, and the faint smell of biosealant. I sat down on the platform opposite his. The medic retreated to a discreet distance, probably sensing that this was not a conversation they were meant to hear. "How are your guards?" he asked. That was his first question. Not about the political situation, or the accord, or the strategic implications of the attack. He asked about the 2 soldiers who had fallen trying to protect me. "Alive," I said. "The one who took the chest wound will need reconstruction, but the medics are confident. The other has tissue damage in both legs. She will walk again." He nodded. Something in his shoulders relaxed. "And you?" I asked. 7 scratches. I saw a pulse round hit your shoulder." "Okay, 7 scratches and a bruise." I did not smile. I wanted to, but the question I needed to ask was too heavy for smiling. "Why did you come back for me?" He looked at me. "What do you mean?" in the corridor. You were not assigned to protect me. You are not part of my security detail. You have no political obligation to the Dominion. You are a cultural observer from a provisional species. If I had been captured, your government could have filed a protest and extracted you through diplomatic channels within a week. There was no strategic reason for you to fight your way through 6 armed soldiers to reach me. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he was formulating a strategy or calculating a response. He was quiet because he genuinely did not understand why I was asking. You were in trouble, he said. That is not a reason. Sure it is. It is not a reason. A reason has logic behind it. A reason involves assessment of cost and benefit. A reason explains why the action served your interests. He tilted his head slightly, the way I had seen Earth canines do in educational hollows, when confronted with a sound they could not classify. You really think like that? He said. Everything is a transaction? Everything in the galaxy is a transaction. Not everything, he said. And for the first time, there was an edge to his voice. Not anger, something like sadness. Not everything. I pressed harder. I needed to understand. The not understanding was eating at me like acid, dissolving structures I had relied on my entire life. Your species confuses me. Everything I read about humans, every story I hear, describes the same pattern. You take extraordinary risks for people who cannot repay you. You endure damage that should stop you, and you keep moving. You cross sectors of hostile space for a single crewmate. You hold barricades for 19 days for children that are not yours. Why? He looked at his hands, turned them over, studied the calluses on his palms, the scars across his knuckles, the fresh line of biosealant on his forearm. My dad was a firefighter, he said, back on Earth. You know what that is? The intelligence file describes it as a profession involving the suppression of chemical combustion events. He almost laughed. Yeah, that is technically accurate. My dad ran into burning buildings for a living. Houses, apartment blocks, warehouses. He would put on his gear and walk into a place that was actively trying to kill him, and he would find the people inside and carry them out. For compensation? For a government salary that would make you cry. Firefighters do not do it for money. They do it because the building is burning and there are people inside, and someone has to go in. But why your father specifically? Why not someone else? Harlow looked at me. Because he was there. He was trained, and he was able, and he was there. That is enough. When you are strong enough to help, you are responsible enough to try. My dad told me that when I was 11 years old, and it is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. When you are strong enough to help, you are responsible enough to try. I sat with those words. They settled into me like stones sinking into deep water, displacing things I had assumed were permanent. You joined the military because of your father, I said. I joined because I wanted to be like him. Not the fighting part, the going in part, the walking toward the thing that everyone else is running from because somebody on the other side needs you. And last night, when you went back to the East Wing? Kitchen workers, he said. Groundskeepers. They were in there, and they were scared, and they did not have guns. I did have a gun. Like I said, the math is simple. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not breaking, shifting, like tectonic plates adjusting to a new pressure. The math is not simple, I whispered. The math says you should have stayed behind the guard line. The math says a sergeant from a provisional species has no obligation to die for an alien empire's servants. The math says your life has more strategic value to your government than 18 workers whose names you do not know. He met my eyes. I do know their names. I stared at him. I asked, he said. This morning, I had the medic contact the East Wing staff and get their names. There are 18 of them. I can list them if you want. He learned their names. After the fight, after the fire, after 7 wounds and a burning building, and a night he should not have survived, he asked someone to tell him the names of the people he had saved. I could not speak for a very long time. When I finally trusted my voice, I said, "You are the most frightening person I have ever met, Sergeant Harlow." He looked at me with genuine surprise. Frightening? Yes. I just told you about my dad and firefighters. And you are still scared of me? More than before. He paused, considered this. Is it the kind of scared where I should leave? No. Okay, he said. And waited. We sat in the medical bay, two people from opposite ends of a galaxy that had never prepared either of us for this moment. And the silence between us was the most honest thing I had experienced in 23 years of political ceremony and diplomatic performance. Later that day, my father summoned me to his private study. The meetings had ended, or at least paused, and he looked exhausted in a way I rarely saw him allow. His ceremonial robes were replaced with simple clothes. His blade was set aside. He sat behind his desk like a man, not an emperor. Tell me about the human, he said. I told him. Everything. The stories from the ambassadors, the kitchen attendant's laugh, the way Harlow watched the room, the fight in the corridor, the fire suppression canister, the East Wing. I told him about the firefighter's son from Montana. I told him about the math that was simple. My father listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened a file on his desk console. The intelligence debrief from the night's events. He turned the screen so I could see it. My staff compiled a full analysis of Sergeant Harlow's actions, he said. They cross-referenced his behavior with every human combat record in our archive. 112 documented incidents across 40 years of human galactic interaction. He scrolled through the data. The pattern is consistent. In every case, when humans engage in combat to protect strategic assets, military installations, territorial holdings, their performance is well above galactic average, but within predicted parameters. Effective, professional, impressive, but explicable. He paused. But when humans engage in combat to protect people, specifically identified individuals rather than abstract objectives, their performance exceeds every predictive model we have, by a factor of 3, sometimes 5, in 2 cases, by a factor we could not calculate because the outcome was statistically impossible. He looked at me. They fight harder for people than for anything else, not their own people, any people. The smaller and more helpless the person, the more extreme the response. I nodded. I already knew this. I had seen it with my own eyes. When you told me you were terrified of him, my father said, what did you mean? I had been thinking about this all day. The answer had been forming slowly, like a crystal growing in solution, and now it was clear enough to speak. I am terrified because he makes me feel safe, I said. And nothing in this galaxy has ever made me feel safe before. Every alliance, every treaty, every bond in my life has been conditional. It has always depended on calculation, on what I could offer, what the Dominion could provide, what strategic value I represented. I have never stood next to someone and believed that they would protect me, simply because I was there, and I was in danger, and they could help. My father was very quiet. I do not know what to do with that feeling, I said. I was raised to evaluate, to calculate, to understand that every relationship is a negotiation, and then this human walks into my life and fights through a burning building for people he met 3 days ago, and he does it like breathing, like it is the most natural thing in the universe, and I am terrified because it means that everything I was taught about how the galaxy works might be wrong. My father sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Your mother made me feel the same way, he said. I had not expected that. She was not Kelari, he continued. You know this. She was from the outer colonies, a diplomat's daughter, no strategic value whatsoever. Every advisor I had told me the match was irrational, and she walked into a room and she looked at me, and I knew that she saw me. Not the throne, not the Dominion, just me. And I was terrified. Why? Because trusting someone completely is the most dangerous feeling in the universe, Vietha. It means you have something to lose. It means you have handed someone the power to destroy you, and you are choosing to believe they will not. He looked at me. His gold-flecked eyes, so like mine, held something I had never seen in them before. Tenderness. Your mother never betrayed that trust. Not once, in 18 years. And losing her broke me in ways I have never fully repaired. We sat together in the quiet of his study, father and daughter, emperor and princess, and for a moment we were neither of those things. We were just two people, trying to navigate a feeling that the galaxy had never designed them to carry. That evening, I went to the balcony where I had stood on the first night. The sky was darkening, and the repair crews below had lit work lamps that cast moving shadows across the damaged walls. Harlow was already there. He was leaning on the railing, looking up. The light from the work lamps caught the edge of his jaw, and the bandage on his shoulder, and the lines around his eyes that I realized were not from age but from squinting into distances. Montana, I thought. Wide open spaces. Skies that went on forever. I stood beside him. Not close. Not far. The distance that two people maintain when they have shared something and are not yet sure what it means. "You are still afraid of me," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Do you want me to leave?" "No." He nodded. We stood in silence, and the silence was different from the one in the medical bay. That had been uncertain, this was settled, like a river that had found its channel. He pointed at a cluster of stars low on the horizon. "Can you see those?" 3 in a line with a bright one below. I looked. Yes. That is roughly where Earth is, give or take a few hundred light years. I stared at those stars and tried to imagine the planet behind them, a world of fire and storms and shifting ground, where creatures made of soft tissue and thin bone grew up learning to run into burning buildings, to cross hostile space for a single friend, to hold the line for children they had never met. A world that produced people like the man standing next to me, people who bled easily and broke easily, and died easily, and fought like they had decided that someone else's survival was more important than their own. "Your species is insane," I said. He laughed. That same real laugh I had heard at the feast. "Yeah," he said, "but it works out sometimes." I looked at him, he looked at me, and for the first time since he had walked into the mirror gallery with his blunt teeth and his soft skin and his terrifying quiet eyes, I did not flinch. The fear was still there. It hummed behind my ribs like a low vibration, constant and inescapable. But it was not the fear of a predator anymore. It was the fear of standing at the edge of something vast and realizing that you might fall in, and that falling might not destroy you, and that maybe, just maybe, the falling was the point. "Tell me about Montana," I said. And he did. The morning of the accord ceremony arrived with clear skies and the smell of fresh sealant on repaired walls. I stood in my dressing chamber while my attendants fitted me with the ceremonial vestments. Layer upon layer of woven fabric in the traditional accord colors, deep violet shot through with threads of gold, each layer representing a different aspect of the bond I was about to declare. Loyalty, prosperity, endurance, legacy. The outermost robe bore the crest of the Kellari Dominion, the twin spirals that symbolized our belief in balanced exchange. I had worn versions of these robes 100 times in rehearsal. They had always felt like armor. Today, they felt like a costume. The Accord Hall had been restored overnight. The damage from the attack had been repaired with such speed that you could almost pretend it had never happened. Almost. But if you looked closely, you could see the new sections of wall that did not quite match the old ones, the replacement columns that stood straighter than their centuries-old neighbors, the fresh bioluminescent arrangements that glowed a shade brighter than the ones that had been destroyed. The palace remembered. Stone always does. 300 delegates filled the tiered seating again, though the composition had changed. The vexury section was empty. Drethal was halfway back to hegemony space, having issued a formal statement citing security concerns as his reason for withdrawal. The Kethrani diplomatic contingent sat in subdued silence, their government having disavowed the Keth Varosi attack with frantic speed and offered reparations that my father had not yet accepted or refused. The remaining suitors were assembled at the foot of the altar of accord. Lord Paxson of the Ritheri Conclave, calm and composed, his trade projections updated to account for the new security landscape. High Emissary Nulthek of the Sorvani Union, looking mildly annoyed at the disruption to his carefully planned timeline. 2 minor candidates from smaller factions, filling the gaps left by those who had withdrawn. All of them looked at me as I entered the hall. All of them saw the Dominion. I walked the central aisle at the prescribed pace. My father walked beside me, Emperor Corvan in full ceremonial regalia, his blade at his hip, his face composed into the mask of imperial authority that he had worn for 30 years. Behind us, Counselor Tethanon carried the scroll of accord, the ancient document that would record my choice. The hall was silent, except for the sound of our footsteps on the polished stone. 300 pairs of eyes watched me approach the altar. Each pair belonged to someone who had calculated the odds, assessed the variables, determined which suitor I would choose based on strategic models and political projections. None of them were looking at the corridor. I was. Ben Harlow stood just outside the main entrance, visible through the open doorway. He was in a clean uniform, the torn one presumably discarded. His wounds were sealed and bandaged. He stood with his arms at his sides, not crossed, a posture that I realized meant he was off duty. He was not scanning the room. He was not cataloging threats. He was just standing there, watching, because he had been invited to observe, and he took his responsibilities seriously, even when those responsibilities were as small as attending a ceremony. He was not a suitor. He had no standing. He had no territory, no fleet, no political leverage. He was a sergeant from a provisional species who had been assigned to watch and take notes. He had also walked into fire for me, for kitchen workers, for groundskeepers, for 18 people whose names he had asked for after the fact. I reached the altar of accord. The ancient stone platform rose 3 steps above the hall floor, carved with the names of every princess who had stood here before me, and spoken a name that changed the shape of the galaxy. My grandmother's name was here, my aunt's. Going back 11 generations, every princess who had weighed the options and made the calculation and chosen the alliance that served the Dominion's interests. I climbed the 3 steps. I turned to face the hall. The silence was absolute. Counselor Tethaphon unrolled the scroll of accord and read the ritual opening. The words were ancient, formal, beautiful in the way that very old things are beautiful. They spoke of duty and continuity, and the bonds that held civilizations together across the void. They spoke of the princess's sacred right to choose, and the empire's sacred trust in her judgment. When the reading was done, the hall waited for me to speak a name. I looked at the suitors. Lord Paxan met my eyes with polished confidence. High Emissary Nulthek gave a precise nod. The minor candidates straightened their postures. I looked past them. I looked at the delegates filling the tiered seating, ambassadors, and traders, and military attachés from a dozen species, each one representing a civilization built on the same foundation: calculation, transaction, rational self-interest, clothed in the language of honor and tradition. I looked at the empty Vexuri section, where Drethal had sat 3 days ago, the most feared warlord in the delegation, the suitor everyone assumed I would choose, who had looked at a burning palace and a frightened princess, and done the math and walked away. And I looked at the corridor, where Ben Harlow stood with his arms at his sides and his blunt teeth and his quiet eyes, a man who did not do math when people were in danger. I spoke. I will not speak a name today. The silence broke, not all at once, but in fractures, gasps, and murmurs, and the sharp click of Counselor Tethion's secondary palate. My father, standing at the base of the altar, went very still. I continued. 3 nights ago, this palace was attacked. 60 armed soldiers breached our walls, disabled our defenses, and moved through these halls with the intention of taking me hostage. I will not describe the events in detail. You have all read the security reports, but I will tell you what those reports do not capture. I felt my voice steadying. The trembling that had lived in my hands for days was gone. Something else had taken its place: clarity. When the walls were breached and the lights went dark, I learned something about the nature of protection. I learned it not from our allies, not from our suitors, not from the powerful and the strategic and the well-positioned. I learned it from a sergeant, a cultural observer from a provisional species who was not part of the ceremony, not part of the alliance, not part of any calculation that brought any of us to this hall. I could feel the delegates stirring. This was not how the accord ceremony worked. The princess chose a name. She did not give speeches. Commander Drethal, of the Vexuri hegemony, the suitor most favored for this accord, evaluated the situation and withdrew to his ship. He told me, and I quote, that this was not his war, that the hegemony would negotiate my release if necessary. He looked at a burning palace and a princess in danger, and he ran the calculation, and the calculation told him to leave. The murmurs grew louder. I did not stop. The human did not run a calculation. Sergeant Ben Harlow fought through 6 armed soldiers to reach me. He walked me through a burning palace with 3 wounds he did not mention. And when we reached safety, when he could have stayed behind the guard line and rested and tended to his injuries, he turned around and went back into the fire for 18 palace staff members. Kitchen workers, groundskeepers, maintenance crew, people with no strategic value, no political significance, no leverage whatsoever. I paused. Let the silence build. I asked him why. His answer was 4 words. You were in trouble. The hall was completely still now. I have spent my entire life in this palace, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. I have been educated in strategy, diplomacy, alliance theory, and the mathematics of political survival. Every lesson I have ever learned has taught me that the galaxy runs on transactions, that protection is purchased, that loyalty is leased, that every bond is a contract with terms and conditions and exit clauses. I looked at Lord Paxson. You offer me trade networks. I looked at High Emissary Nulthek. You offer me diplomatic reach. I looked at the minor candidates. You offer me stability. I looked at the corridor. He offers nothing. He has nothing to offer. No fleet, no territory, no strategic advantage. He is a sergeant from a planet that most of you could not find on a star map. I took a breath. And he is the only person in this hall who walked into fire for me, without being asked, without being paid, without a treaty or an obligation or a contract. He did it because I was scared, and he could help. And on his world, in his family, that is enough. I turned back to the hall. I will not choose a suitor today, not because I am afraid, not because the attack has shaken my resolve, but because I have learned that the Accord's premise is flawed. We have spent 11 generations choosing mates based on what they can give us. We have never once asked what they would sacrifice for us. We measure alliance in ships and resources and territory. We have never measured it in courage. I looked at my father. He stood at the base of the altar with his hands at his sides and his gold-flecked eyes fixed on me, and I could not read his expression. It was not anger, it was not disappointment. It was something I had never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like recognition. I do not know what the future holds for the Dominion, I said. I do not know if this decision will cost us alliances or trade routes or strategic advantage. But I know this. The next time the walls fall and the lights go dark, I want to stand beside someone who will go back into the fire. Not because it is rational, not because it is strategic, because it is right. The hall erupted. Delegates shouted. Advisors surged to their feet. 2 of the remaining suitors turned and left without a word. Counselor Tethion stood frozen with the scroll of Accord hanging from his hands, the ancient parchment trembling. My father raised his hand. Silence fell like a blade. Emperor Corvan climbed the 3 steps to the altar. He stood beside me and looked out at the assembled delegates, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 11 generations. The Accord of Bonding has always been about securing the Dominion's future, he said. For 11 generations, this ceremony has produced alliances that protected our borders and expanded our influence. My daughter has shown me that the future is not secured by fleets alone. He looked at me. I held my breath. The character of those who stand beside us matters more than the size of their armada. Courage is not a resource that can be traded or purchased. It is given freely or not at all. He turned back to the hall. The ceremony is suspended. The princess will choose in her own time, on her own terms. The Dominion will honor her judgment. It was the first time in 11 generations that the accord had been broken. The silence that followed my father's words was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a galaxy recalculating. The hall cleared slowly. Delegates filed out in clusters, talking in low, urgent voices, their communication devices already active. By nightfall, this moment would be transmitted across 100 star systems. The story would change shape as it traveled, as stories do, but the core of it would hold. I descended the altar steps. My father touched my shoulder as I passed, a brief pressure that said more than any words could. I walked through the hall, past the empty seats and the fading bioluminescent light, toward the corridor. Ben Harlow was still there. He had not moved. He had heard everything. I stopped in front of him. The ceremonial vestments felt heavy and wrong, layers of tradition that no longer fit. "You did not have to do that," he said. His voice was quiet. "I know. Your advisors are going to make your life very difficult. I know. I am not a politician. I do not have a fleet. I do not have territory or trade networks or diplomatic leverage. I am a sergeant. I fix things and I fight when fighting needs doing. That is all I am." I looked at him. At the bandage on his shoulder, and the healing cut on his forearm, and the tired lines around his eyes that came from too many nights spent running into burning buildings. "You went back into a burning palace for people whose names you did not know." "Yeah. And then you learned their names." He paused. "Yeah. That is not all you are, Sergeant Harlow. That is everything." He met my eyes. And in that moment, standing in a corridor outside an empty ceremony hall, wearing robes that represented a tradition I had just shattered, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen directed at me by anyone in the galaxy. He was not calculating my value. He was not assessing my strategic significance. He was not looking at the throne behind me, or the empire I represented. He was looking at me. Just me. The girl in the two heavy robes who was shaking again. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of a choice that could not be taken back. "I have a question," I said. "Okay. If you had to choose between going back to Earth and staying here, in a place where everything is strange, and the food is wrong, and the gravity is slightly off, and the only person you know is a princess who just caused a diplomatic crisis in front of 300 delegates, what would your calculation be?" He smiled, that small, quiet smile that I had first seen directed at a kitchen attendant and a Rythery server and a Kilari medic and 18 rescued strangers. The smile that was never strategic and never performed and never conditional. "I told you," he said. "I do not do math when people need me." We stood in the corridor, and the galaxy turned around us, vast and cold and transactional, and between us was something that the galaxy had no formula for. In the days that followed, the story spread. Not the political story. The Dominion's analysts and diplomats handled that one, managing the fallout, renegotiating with the remaining delegations, absorbing the economic consequences of a broken accord. That story was complicated and messy and full of the kind of strategic maneuvering that had always defined my world. But the other story spread farther and faster and deeper. The story of the human who fought for strangers. It traveled through trade routes and diplomatic channels and mess hall conversations on stations and ships across the galaxy. A Telleri freighter captain told it to a Nerathi dock worker, who told it to a Sorvani merchant, who told it to a Kethrani engineer. Each telling added a detail or lost one, but the core remained. A human went back into the fire, not for money, not for power, not for territory or leverage or political advantage. He went back because people were inside, and they were scared, and he could help. And an alien princess looked at the most powerful suitors in the galaxy and said no. She said that courage mattered more than fleets. She said that the willingness to sacrifice for a stranger was worth more than any trade network or border treaty. The galaxy did not know what to do with that. For as long as anyone could remember, the great civilizations had operated on the same principle. You protected what was yours. You calculated risk. You survived. You accumulated power, and you used it to accumulate more power. And the purpose of alliance was to make yourself stronger, and the purpose of strength was to make yourself safe. Humans did not fit that model. They did not protect what was theirs. They protected what was near. The distinction was so fundamental that most species could not even articulate it. Yours implied ownership, calculation, a ledger of debts and obligations. Near was something else entirely. Near was physical, immediate, present tense. It meant that if you were standing next to a human when danger came, you were under their protection, regardless of whether they knew your name, regardless of whether you could repay them, regardless of whether protecting you made any strategic sense at all. It was irrational. It was inefficient. It was completely, devastatingly, irrevocably beautiful. And across the galaxy, slowly, in whispered conversations and private journals, and late-night arguments between diplomats who had been trained to see the universe as a system of equations, people began to ask a question that no one had thought to ask before. What if the galaxy could be kinder, not weaker, not softer, not naive, but kinder? What if protection did not have to be purchased? What if loyalty did not require a contract? What if the measure of a civilization was not the size of its fleet, but the depth of its willingness to fight for someone else? It was a dangerous question. Dangerous because once you asked it, you could not unask it. Dangerous because it demanded something that no strategic model could quantify. It demanded that you care, not because caring was efficient, but because someone, somewhere, was hurting, and you were strong enough to help. I know this because I asked it. I stood on a balcony and looked at the stars and asked it, and the answer changed me in ways that I am still discovering. Ben Harlow stayed, not because I asked him to, not because the Dominion offered him a position or a title or any of the things the galaxy uses to buy loyalty. He stayed because he wanted to, and wanting to was enough. We are not a love story, not yet, maybe not ever. What we are is harder to define and more important. We are proof that the galaxy's oldest equation, the one that says every relationship is a transaction, is missing a variable. The variable is this. Sometimes, a person walks into your life and fights for you without being asked, and the only rational response is to become the kind of person who would do the same. I am learning. It is slow and difficult, and it terrifies me daily. I was raised in a palace built on calculation, and unlearning calculation is like unlearning gravity. But I am learning. My name is Vietha, third princess of the Kellari Dominion, daughter of Emperor Corvan, breaker of the Accord. And I am no longer afraid.